Hello and welcome. I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about data management and GDPR and data privacy. And specifically, we're going to focus in on how to solve the right to be forgotten problem, which is something that I think comes up a lot in these conversations. Specifically, there's components of these regulations that allow users to request that they be removed, and that creates a particular problem when we talk about backups and archives and things like that. Joining me on the webinar is Vicki Gray. Vicki is with Operavi. Vicki, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, good to talk to you, George.
Glad to have you. Hey, before we jump too far in the presentation, you want to give a quick 30 seconds on what Operavi does?
Absolutely. Okay. Happy to be here to be talking about GDPR and data privacy. That is actually something that we can address, but it's not the primary focus of what brought us to market. So Operavi is intelligent multi-cloud data management, which can index, classify, retain, and retrieve data, unstructured data for long-term retention and everything that goes around that. And of course, I'll be talking a lot more about it, but that's the short answer.
Okay. So basically how to find all the stuff that you've been keeping.
Yes, right. And as we talk to people, and you were just telling me this the other day, how many people keep everything, right? There's just
exactly,
a ton of clients out there that never get rid of anything. Well, how do you organize that and retain it and for all kinds of reasons, and then find it when you need it? We solve that problem.
Awesome. All right, so let's kind of jump into the meat of the presentation here. I think the big thing that I like to get across, Vicki, is this is just not uniquely a European problem, right? That we're seeing these types of. There's a couple things that I'm seeing happen. Number one, the awareness on the part of the consumer, I think, is increasing exponentially. I think we've all been kind of a little bit naive and just assumed that people would do the right things with our data and things like that. And as we're seeing, it seems like Facebook gets hammered every other day for doing something wrong. And so I think that just from a consumer perspective, we're starting to see people become really in tune to their data and data privacy. And then, of course, I think organizations are beginning to understand really the value of the asset and being able to make sure it's protected. And like you said, be able to find that stuff. Are you guys seeing similar type of awareness?
We are, and as you know, we're a California company, and so it's become front of mind in California just recently because of the California Consumer Privacy Act that you mentioned here. There's just over a year before that goes into effect, but it mirrors a lot of what GDPR does, and I understand that even in Congress there's some discussion about implementing there's some legislation working its way through that may do a similar thing. So even though it's at the moment GDPR is in Europe, I think a lot of the world is looking at that and thinking of implementing similar things, just like California already has.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine who's based in Germany, actually, kind of teasingly said to me, look, and at least in Europe, these cases are going to be settled by essentially professional judges. In the States, it's going to be settled by a jury of your peers, and that could be a scary thought, if you think about it, right? So I think actually the pressure in the U.S. will actually end up being harder, and especially if we end up with if we don't have a federal legislation. Imagine having 50 states with 50 translations of what data privacy means. It could be that could be a real mess.
Yeah, that could be a real mess. And isn't it interesting that California is the first state to implement this, and it's the home of Google and Facebook and, a lot of the others that have been in the news around this issue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that, I think clearly we as an IT industry have to really take this seriously and really have to get our arms around it. So let's talk a little bit about sort of what this is really about. And it's interesting, as I started to research a couple of years ago now, GDPR and what it really meant, you've known me a long time, and I sort of have a resistance toward anything to do with the government, and I expected the worst, and I've got to tell you that, GDPR, I mean, there's some language I wish they would tighten up and like explain what in a timely manner means and stuff like that. But really, as a first pass, it's actually a pretty decent regulation. I mean, it's not crazy talk. It's really just good data management. What are your thoughts?
Well, as you and I were talking just recently, both of us have been around the data protection world for more years than we want to admit. And I think this is, a reasonable expectation. I think that, as we're going to talk about, a number of the companies are going to struggle, or a number of the vendors are going to struggle to actually deliver against the challenge. But particularly with what's been in the news, it's a reasonable reaction to what's happened with people's data. So all of us as you say, all of us in the IT world have got to get our acts together to be able to deliver what, people are demanding.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if we look at, if you really were to boil any of this stuff down, and this was my reaction when I first read the GDPR document, this is just good, solid data management. If you had been doing, good, solid data management best practices that we've been in place for years, you could be in a good position to follow this. I think the challenge is now some of these aspects of this regulation or these regulations really change the focus, right? It will change the way we protect data. And will also change the way we retain data. And so I think that those two aspects are worth exploring a little bit, specifically retention, because retention is interesting to me. Vicki, you and I were talking yesterday. I recently gave a talk on this exact subject, and there was about 45 people or so in the room, and I asked how many people retain their backup data for more than 5 years, and every hand in the room went up. And I don't think that's unusual. I think that a lot of people count on backup as retention, and I think, as we'll talk about, that might not be a good idea anymore. You need a really, really smart data protection product to be able to pull this off. And so I think if you look at a data retention policy, what we've always focused on there was really from an IT aspect. It was how long is the organization going to store data, and then what is a justifiable deletion of data. I think to what you just said, that what we see increasingly is that data is increasingly considered an asset, and people now want to keep it for either a very long time or forever, which also loosely translates into a very long time. And like you said, we've been around the data protection space for a while. Is that a trend you're seeing as well, as that people just are retaining data? The default policy to me now basically says don't delete it ever.
Yeah, well, yes, and as long as I've been doing this, whenever I asked an audience or individual customers how long they keep their data, it always shocked me how many of them said all data forever. It's a huge trend, and I think that years ago, when your volume of unstructured data, and we haven't really gotten into that yet, but when the amount of unstructured data was a much smaller part of your overall data, you could try and use backup for retention. It wasn't as much of a stretch as it is today. But if you look at today's world, with a huge amount of unstructured data vastly taking over the total amount, it's just untenable to try and use backup for long-term data retention as well. But
yeah,
people
exactly.
are still trying to do it.
Yep, and I totally agree with you. I think that last bullet is really important too, is that GDPR requires us to protect data, retain it, and also remove it And the problem is that we typically are guilty in the industry of treating those three words as three separate processes, right? That we would protect one way, we would retain another way, and then we would remove a third way. And what, if you really kind of read what GDPR and these other data privacy laws are really communicating, is what they're asking for will require either an integration of those processes, or at least a high level of communication between the processes. And I think, you alluded to this earlier, I think a lot of vendors are really going to struggle in pulling those three aspects together. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I know you're going to jump into this a little bit more about the challenges of a lot of the legacy architectures in backup to be able to do this. And it illustrates why you actually have to think about this and your long-term retention of unstructured data in a different format, in a different way, because you won't be able to meet the requirements, some of the requirements in GDPR using your classic backup architectures. So let's get into that, George.
Okay. So I think the big problem, because the slide said so, is the right to be forgotten. And so let me kind of explain to our viewers what we're talking about there. So under GDPR, let's just say John Smith can call up and say, I'd like you to remove all my data from your system, and then you have to respond to that request in a timely manner. Now this is an area where I think there's some, we need some case law, frankly, to understand what is meant by timely manner and what we mean by all data, because at least I'm reading the law to say all data means all data. Other people who are particularly damaged by this are reading the law to say all data doesn't mean, for example, data on tapes, which I can't figure out where they come up with that. But I'm not a lawyer. What's interesting about this is it nullifies user agreements. Almost everybody, well, there's many user agreements that you probably agree to that you haven't read. And this, for all intents and purposes, gives you the ability to nullify that agreement and force the organization to remove the data. So it's kind of an interesting aspect. And what's interesting is my translation of this is the removal doesn't have to be instantaneous, meaning that John Smith calls up and 30 seconds later all his data is gone. But it does have to, the phrase is timely manner, which isn't clearly defined. But I think we can agree it's not 6 months and it's not 60 seconds. It's probably, I think if you have a policy that says a week or a day or something like that, I think that's generally considered reasonable. And so I think that's areas where this really becomes a challenge as we start to explore what the impact is from a backup perspective, right? So I have some of those examples there. So if you think about this, put yourself in the position of an administrator receiving this request, and you can, depending on how you use John Smith's data and what of his data you stored, it's generally easy to remove it from primary stores. There's plenty of tools out there that would search for that. It is important that there would be a separate step, though. It's also, I'm going to skip to the last bullet. It's relatively straightforward to remove it from an archive, because archives generally are set up and tagged, and we can do things there. But the real problem is, and where we've seen a lot of discussion around, is it's really hard to remove it from a backup. Vicki, as we've said a couple of times now, you and I have a pretty good history in the whole backup space, and backups have always been sort of these job-driven Neanderthals, and so data isn't stored in a way that's really logical to a human, right? They're stored. Here's what I backed up Saturday night. Here's what I backed up Sunday night. Here's what I backed up Monday night, and the ability to search across all of those different jobs becomes more difficult the older the job gets, right?
Well, and just think about all the, for anybody who's still using tape, and there's a lot, think about all your offsite tapes. How do you search those, right? It's a very cumbersome procedure.
Yeah, well, and you and I, at the company we actually met at, I can remember that we would advise customers to kind of prune their data, the metadata that was being tracked after a period of time to save storage space, because the database, the metadata database got so big, right? And so and those things still exist, and so you're actually making it more difficult, because there's also no time limit on when John Smith can call you up. If John Smith calls you up 8 years from now and wants all of his 8 years of data removed, as I read the regulation, you have to comply. And so imagine trying to find John Smith data from 8 years ago. It's just going to be very difficult.
And you have to show, right? You have to show that you actually did do it.
Yes. And that's kind of an interesting thing to me. How do you prove that you did something that no longer exists, right? It's like, so it becomes a real challenge, right? Proving that something didn't happen is much harder than proving that something did happen, right? So, so if you look at it again, we kind of touched on this. Is most organizations count on backup for data retention, and so I'll ask you that are viewing this is, how long are you keeping your backup data? And if you think about it, just purely from a backup process, we can hit you with survey after survey that shows that 80 to 90% of restore requests come from either the most recent or the next most recent backup. The amount of times you actually pull data from a backup that's 3 or 4 years old is almost immeasurable, right? So I think part of it is to kind of just rethink that part of the process. And, Vicki, you touched on this earlier, and this, I think, really gets to where this becomes really difficult. In the 90s, when we had a file server, we were on the lookout for file servers with hundreds of thousands of files, because it would take a while to back them up, and because all backups at that time were file by file. The unstructured data growth, where now it's incredibly common to see a file server with 1 million files on it, and certainly we have, especially in big data and IoT environments, we have servers that are pushing 1 billion files. That unstructured data growth has led most backup vendors, I would say at this point, to do something called a image level backup, right? And so in an image level backup, what we're doing is essentially saying, look, I'm not going to inspect what's in the volume. I'm just going to back up the volume, and I'm going to look for blocks of data that are changing and just pull those blocks over. So and that creates a problem when we go to look for data right now. Now, most of these vendors that have, I'd say, in fact, today I'd probably say comfortably all of them have the ability to do a single file restore. But in almost every case, you have to know exactly what backup job, there's that word again, contains the file you're looking for. It's very difficult to say, give me this version of this file and let me know what jobs hold it. And most, at least that I know of, applications can't do that. And so this unstructured data growth is really, it's not really necessarily the source of the problem, Vicki, but it's really compounding the situation as far as being able to find and identify this data, right?
Yes, it is. And in fact, what we've been seeing, besides the millions and millions of files, millions and millions of discrete files, each which needs to be, handled and managed. Like you say, that unstructured data growth is unbelievable. So back when, in the early days when you and I were doing this, structured data typically would represent 3/4 or more of the overall data, and most IT managers had a fairly flippant attitude towards the unstructured data, like, oh, that's just user data. Remember that? That's flipped on its head now, and it's most of the analysts are projecting that unstructured data within just a few years here is going to represent 90% or more of all the data out there, and organizations have already come to recognize that unstructured data has huge value, right? It's not just just your office documents, but video files, audio files, anything else, for a variety of reasons, not just compliance, but company history, business intelligence. There's a huge amount of value there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's a really interesting point. If you think about like in the 90s and even early 2000s, when we talked about data protection, it was how fast can I back up Oracle, right? I've now given presentations in this decade where I say, look, if you're backing up Oracle, if you're counting on your backup of your Oracle database as your primary recovery thing, you're doing it wrong, right? We're in most of these applications, we're doing something else, right? And so actually, data protection now should be much more focused on unstructured data, because that's the stuff that it really can manage and maintain, right? Now, I'm not saying, by the way, I didn't officially say don't back up your Oracle data, but it should be less of a, if you're going to your backup to recover your Oracle environment, it's because something really, really bad has happened to replication and high availability that you might have in the situation. The other trend that we're tracking, Vicki, which is kind of interesting, is we saw a group of vendors come to market, let's say from 2005 to 2012-ish, that were focused typically on a particular environment, like maybe VMware or NoSQL or something like that. And what's interesting there we see is that the metadata that these guys track is actually less, has less value or less detail than the kind of the really old guard guys that used to have to manage tapes and things like that. And so the semi-modern solutions, I guess I would call them, have actually gotten worse at the metadata they track. So this all becomes a real problem when we go to recover information and fulfill that, hey, John Smith just called up, how do I get his data back? So we're going to talk about two solutions that we hear a lot, and I'm using solutions in air quotes, but that we hear a lot from vendors, and I think functionally they work to some level. I think there's no guarantee that they meet the letter of the law, so to speak, in GDPR. There's some assumptions that they will. So let's first talk about delete and restore. So what we're talking about here is the ability to, when a restore request comes in, you keep a list of people that have been forgotten. As the restore is occurring, you're comparing to that list to see if that person's on that list. If the person's on the list, you essentially restore to device null or don't restore at all. And then if they are not on that list, then you go ahead and restore as normal. Now, the problem that we see with this is a couple things. First of all, there is no clarification on whether or not you have the right to keep a list. There is some language in these regulations that say that you can maintain some data to protect the business. So the assumption is that list would be okay. And I would tend to agree with that, because I think it's hard to come up with a way to prove that you've deleted somebody if you don't have a record that they ever requested to be deleted. So I think there's some legitimacy there, but clearly there is no case law at this point anyways to be totally clear on that. Probably the bigger thing that I'd be concerned here, and Vicki, we've always talked about speed of restore and how important it is. Boy, inserting, and I think the vendors that talk about this aren't thinking about what we're talking about. The couple of companies that we have worked with that specifically were dealing with GDPR issues are tracking thousands, and not dozens, but thousands of users that have requested to be removed, right? And so what that means on the recovery process is for every single one, you're going to have to do this check 1,000 times. And my assumption would be that's just going to crush backup recovery times, right?
Well, and I mean, think about it. You back up at leisure and you restore in a panic. So
good point.
Yeah, that's highly problematic, right?
Yeah.
When the business is down for some reason and you're trying to restore it, you need to be back up and running as fast as possible, which is why the backup vendors have spent so much time trying to ensure that Restore is a fast job, and this throws a big wrench into it.
Yeah, and I do believe, by the way, that the let's call it legacy backup vendors, this will probably be the path that many of them choose. What we see as the kind of immediate, again, I'm using air quotes here, but as the immediate solution is this kind of a restore to sandbox idea. And to be very frank, this is horrible. So basically what happens here is you restore to an isolated area of your data center. So there's risk of exposure because, there's isolation and then there's isolation. And then you have to manually check to make sure that the forgotten user's data isn't in there, as opposed to, at least with the delete and restore, a computer's doing the work. So the challenge there is, again, what we see is vendors being kind of short-sighted in that, because, again, they're thinking a dozen people have asked to be forgotten. Well, if you're dealing with thousands of people that have asked to be forgotten, and you have to do this on every single restore, you could throw hours, if not days, into the restore process. Now, I assume at some level you could probably script some of this, but again, then you got to write all the scripts and you got to maintain all the scripts, and it's just a very, very problematic situation, I think. And so I think that really becomes a challenge. And again, I go back to the regulation. I don't know if recovering data that you were supposed to forget to an isolated area works, right? I don't know if that follows regulation. And I think, Vicki, the big problem that I'm going to let you comment on is we don't even know, and all these two things assume that it's okay to keep forgotten users' data within the backup umbrella itself. And clearly the both regulations are, at least at best, unclear in whether or not that's a possibility, correct?
Well, and that is actually, and we talked about it before, I said that I find that highly problematic, that if the regulation says that you have the right to be forgotten, imagine if you requested this and an organization's response was, okay, sure, but we're going to keep all your data unless and until there's a restore, and then we'll promise to get rid of it. I'm not feeling so good about the fact that you've actually forgotten me, right? Because it's actually still, all that data is still out there on all those backup jobs.
Right.
So I question the fundamental premise behind both of these, that you can actually keep it until there is a restore.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't argue that point. I think that's a reasonable thing to be questioning. The other thing to look at and as an option, and this is one, frankly, that at Storage Switzerland we've done just because this was actually before we had met the folks at Apparavi, but is replacing backup with archive. So everything we've talked about is really a data management function. It is knowing where your data is, what's in your data, it's being tagged properly. There's a rich metadata history being developed. Well, all of that is, well, I shouldn't say all, but many archive solutions have that ability. And so what we had to do with these is not retain. We actually set the backup retention policy to 7 days, and then everything goes to an archive. What we're counting on is that research data shows that most recoveries happen from last night's backup. But this still creates a problem. This gets you closer, I think. But the problem that you have is, how do we get everything to the archive, right? And if you look at most archiving solutions, first of all, archiving solutions tend to be very siloed. There's a group of vendors that offer archiving hardware in the terms of object storage or tape libraries or cloud storage. And then there's the archive software guys, well on the other side, and you have to kind of put these things together, which is difficult. The other challenge you have is that archive software vendors they're not backup vendors typically, and so they don't design their software to move data rapidly to anything. So you reintroduce a performance problem. The other thing you introduce now is you're also transferring data twice, right? You've got your backup job running, and then you've got an archive job running behind it in some form or fashion. And so, there's all kinds of network impact issues. There's all kinds of concerns around that. It's closer, but what we really need, I think, and this is what we'll kind of wrap up with here, is to integrate the two processes, right? So I think it's reasonable to say, look, let's do something. We're going to put structured databases, in particular applications, into their own bucket. We're going to have replication and high availability and things like that. We might want to copy in the backup for long-term, some sort of long-term strategy. But specifically, what we want to focus on is the unstructured data. And so what we need to actually return to is file-by-file backup. But Vicki, we don't want to do that and make backup windows go through the roof again, right? And so this has to be much more intelligent than the way we used to do file-by-file backup in the 90s, right?
Yep. And but you're right as well in that you don't want to have to run two jobs on the same set of data. So we have to have a way to integrate. Just as you say here, you've got to have the archive capabilities, but you've got to integrate backup into it as well, so that you're not running two processes and two jobs on the same set of data.
Right. And there's a saying, this mantra that's been around for a while in the industry, that backup is an archive, and I would tend to agree with that, and that gets into that seven-year retention thing. But we've never said that archive can't be backup, right? And so what we're really talking about here is merging the two processes, and at the back end, you really count on rich metadata, and it really becomes more than archive, it becomes data management. And so that's the rich metadata tracking, being able to know a lot more about the individual files than what we've known in the past. And then at that point, if you think about it, roll back to our John Smith request, removing John Smith from this type of arrangement is relatively straightforward. In fact, it should take seconds, if not minutes, right? So it should be a relatively straightforward process to identify that person and remove them from that secondary storage area in addition to the primary storage area. And I think that, Vicki, you brought up the point that the problem with delete on restore and restore to a sandbox still may be in violation of the core tenet of the right to be forgotten. This is essentially totally compliant with it at that point, correct?
That's right. So yeah, let's jump into how we're looking at this.
Well, yeah, and so
okay.
just to kind of introduce you, we ran into you guys, I guess it was about the beginning of this year, really almost after we went through that one project, which was kind of brutal, and I'm like, this is perfect, right? And so now obviously I don't want people to leave this webinar thinking that Operavi is solely focused on GDPR, and I know you'll talk about that, but you guys do a lot, but it's really focused on this multi-cloud data management. So I'll let you run through your stuff here, and I'll come back in a little bit. Okay,
great. Yeah, thanks, George. So, right, we are intelligent multi-cloud data management, and it just so happens that because of the intelligence that we designed into the product, that it turns out it works really well for GDPR and the right to be forgotten. But it does more than that as well. So let me start with just a little bit about Operavi, because George said, he came upon us early this year. We had our formal launch of the product in May. Before that, we were having some early adopters, try out the platform and work with them to refine it. We were founded in 2016. The company's privately funded, and we have a SaaS-based platform, and we intelligently and actively archive unstructured data. with the idea that you can not only access it and use it today, but you can intelligently keep it forever for all kinds of uses. So let's talk, I want to jump right in. I'll tell you more about the different functions that Operavi can do, but I want to address this idea of GDPR and that we have a completely different approach. So first of all, when we bring all the data into Operavi, the files and the increments are stored as individual objects, and that's what enables us to create a rich metadata database around what is in there, and therefore be able to act on it. We have a very fast upload to the cloud, and I'll talk a little bit more about how what the destinations are. And you can have configurable concurrent transport to increase the speed and have it go very fast. But it gives you this granular control over the data. And we have this data classification and tagging capability that is based on both the content and a rich set of metadata. And we actually deliver a set of predefined classifications. If you think about ones like, say, confidential or legal are good predefined ones, but they're not the only ones that an administrator can use. You can actually define your own classifications, and so that starts to get extremely rich. You can even think about them from a business standpoint to say, like, all sales data is tagged, all finance data is tagged. There's just an infinite different ways that you can classify your data now, which provides much greater control and access over the long term. Operavi is also fully content aware, and this is key to the whole GDPR piece, because as my little image here shows, it says find all instances of XXX-XX-XXXX, either a specific number for, say, social security number, which doesn't cover in Europe, but is very appropriate here in the US, and retrieve each of those. So you can have a specific instance or generic and retrieve all social security numbers, or say find all instances of our friend John Smith, who's asked to be forgotten, and retrieve those. And because we are fully content aware and can do a full content search, it can do that. So you can then set rules for storage location based on data types. So you could put all of this PII, personally identifiable information, into a particular storage destination, whether it be on premises or in a particular cloud, or other ways that you could modify it. Now, George, when you and I were talking, you thought this was quite interesting. Did you want to comment on this data classification and search?
Well, yeah, I think that, one of my comments is if you can't find it, you haven't stored it, right? And so the fact that, you keep data forever, for example, if you don't know where it is, or if it takes you, too long to find that data, you might as well not even have stored it in the first place, right? And so I think we're guilty of storing data just in case, and that's fine. But if you can't find it, then I don't know why you did it in the first place, right? So the classification and being able to understand what you have, where you have it, and why you have it, I think becomes critical. Because I think we haven't talked about, we've obviously focused on data privacy here, but part of it is just straight out data growth. We're going to, and it's not necessarily the cost of hard disks or even SSDs, it's the cost of data centers. When you start to run out of floor space, building a new data center gets really, really expensive.
Well, and you can have multiple destinations for your data, but in terms of what you were just saying about if people are storing data just in case, with Operavi, what we do is we take what has been essentially an opaque, black hole of data, right? Those images that you don't know what is there or where it is, and made it fully content aware and essentially available for actionable insights or specific retrieval for exactly like right to be forgotten, but other uses as well. Okay, so let's jump on to and talk a little bit more about different functions and features that we have. So we offer dynamic hybrid cloud storage. So you can actually define any destination for your storage. It can be on premises, any data path, so on premises, private cloud, or any public cloud. And you can have a multitude of them as well. And the next that I want to talk about is data-centric retention policy. So this is that we have automated content and metadata classification that we were just talking about that helps you to define the different classes of data, where you want it stored and how you want it stored. We have, this piece is very important. Our cloud active data pruning allows you to set retention policies at either the file or the sub-file level so that in the future, should you want to get rid of certain data, you can. And, you know, if you talk to the lawyers, they'll tell you that after a certain period of time, maybe 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, in fact, it's valuable to get rid of data. Well, Operavi allows an administrator to set policies based on what legal or compliance may be telling you for removal of data. So saving your data, protecting your data, retaining your data is really critical, but having an intelligent method to prune and remove and delete data based on company compliance rules is critical, and Operavi allows you to do that. We mentioned this advanced archive search, so you can search by full content, anything. It can search for, you know, words before, words after. So it gives you a really great control over how to use your data long term. We also have auditing reporting that gives you logs on who changed what and when, which is really valuable as you're trying to track what's happened with the data and to be able to verify that, in fact, you did execute on this right to be forgotten. So this is an architecture slide that talks a little bit about our data sources, and there is a software appliance that takes the data from the data sources and moves it out based on your policies to the various destinations. So you can have different data types or different data sources go to different locations. Will also help you to move from one location to the next over time based on your policies. And this gives the user storage and cloud mobility. So as new cloud vendors come on the market with potentially better economics, you can over time migrate your data from one place to the next to take advantage of that. We also have an open data format, which means that there's no software or cloud lock-in. Many years from now, if you're no longer using Operavi, but you had data stored, we give you a published format for that data so you're not forever locked into having the application, as is typical with all your legacy vendors, backup vendors. Intelligent data management, we've talked a bit about that, and that has to do with the classification, full content search. So we are now storing the data in an intelligent way that allows you to manage it over time. Also, we have an innovative SaaS-based model that means that you've got no upfront costs. So you don't have to invest in, expensive enterprise license over, many years with this huge upfront cost. You can purchase as you want over time and grow it over time. We have an extensive partner ecosystem that we're always adding to. We can run on Windows, Linux, Ubuntu, Red Hat. Our storage destinations include both on-premises, such as Caringo or Scality or Cloudian, but also the major cloud vendors, and we keep adding to these. So besides these, just keep an eye. If you've got a cloud vendor that is your favorite, or your own private cloud that you need us to certify. It's a simple process, and we do it all day long. We've recently enjoyed a bunch of recognition since launching the product earlier this year. We have gotten quite a number of these, data storage startups to watch from Enterprise Storage and CRN and others, and we're really proud of those. So with that, George, I think I'd like to turn it over to you so we have time for some questions.
Yes, we do. And so, by the way, I did want to point out that that's the Santa Monica pier right there in the picture.
We are we are just down from the pier.
Yep, I went for, when I was visiting your office, I went for a run and saw that, and I think, I think that's supposed to be like famous or something. So, but I failed geography. So yeah, so if you'll go through and prioritize a few of those questions that have come in, we do have quite a few in the queue. Before we get to your questions, just a couple of housekeeping items. At the bottom of your player, there's an attachments button. You can click on that, and there's all kinds of additional information where we've done a couple of deeper dives. There's also kind of an overview of the Aparavi products, so you can get all that there. So feel free to click on those. You don't need to register again or anything. Also,
and let me just say, George, I want to chime in and say that we have a free trial as well. Two things: we're happy to give anybody a demo. Just visit the website and click on Request a Demo. But we also offer a free trial. So anybody who wants to check it out and try it, just log in. Go to our website and click on Start Your Free Trial. Okay.
And then if you're an on-demand viewer, we'll add a link to that demo right in the attachment section, so you can click right on it. Also before or after the questions are done and before you leave, if you would do us a favor and give us some feedback on the session today, what you thought of it. Star rating system, 5 stars being the best. That is all the housekeeping. Oh, and I did have a question come in: will the webinar be available on demand? The answer is yes. It should be about 5 minutes after we are done today. If you missed a section or got in late, feel free to come back and listen. If you think this information would be valuable to a colleague or friend in the industry, please capture the link. It's the exact same link that you use to come to the live event. Will also work for the on-demand event, so feel free to send that to them. Under GDPR laws, I'm pretty sure that's better for you to send it to them than I am. So there you go. Vicki, you ready for a few questions here?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. So there's one that I saw come in that I thought I wanted to ask, and I'll let you kind of jump in there if you want to. If I set my current backup solution and do a file-by-file backup instead of an image backup, won't that cover you in GDPR? No, for a couple of reasons. First of all, again, I'm only going within the scope of backup software solutions that I know, which I think is pretty good. You could do a file-by-file backup, but it still would be job-based, and you would still have trouble removing an individual set of files from within those jobs. In fact, it's probably impossible in most cases. The other problem you're going to have is time. There's a very good reason that the legacy solutions all went to image-based backups, because it would take them days, literally, to back up a server with a million or a billion files on it. The other thing, my other part of that would be many of the modern or next generation, I don't even know what I would call them, products brought to market after 2005 and before 2016 may not even have the option to do a file-by-file backup. So you may want to do one, but you're not going to be able to. And even if you could, I don't think it would help you much. Anything you would add to that, Vicki?
Yeah, I agree with you. And one of the things that you need, that we built into the solution, is the ability to easily retrieve data wherever it is and not require the administrator to know that, right? To know which, like as you talk about it, which job it's in or where it's stored. So Operavi makes that completely seamless. You just ask for the data, and Operavi goes and finds it. You don't have to know where it is.
There you go. Good. So we got time for a couple more questions. But before I do that, I want to put the contact information up on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us by any of those. If you're an on-demand viewer and want to ask a question, you can tweet us questions at StorageSwish. You can also email me directly. That is my legitimate email address. I do not, however, need any offers for gold mines in foreign countries. I'm all set on gold mines as it speaks right now. So let's see. Next, let's take this question. So I think you touched on this a little bit, Vicki, but what on-premises storage systems do you support?
You can actually define any data path, and that will work just fine. It's funny, we do talk to customers the divide. I'd be interested to see what you say about this, George. That some customers are absolutely committed to the cloud and are have an active multi-cloud strategy going. But it always surprises me to how many are still saying, they have a corporate policy that they will not put data in the cloud. And so for Operavi, that's perfectly fine. Many of them are setting up their own private clouds, and we can support those or any data path that they define. So although we market ourselves as enabling a multi-cloud strategy, and by the way, this is just a funny aside. If you talk to Amazon, their idea of multi-cloud is, S3 and Glacier, but we don't need that. But so while we enable you to do that, you're not restricted to that. You can keep everything on premises if you like.
Yeah, I'm kind of like, I can argue both points. The cheapskate in me that has a 10-year-old car says, do the math. Leasing or renting 100 petabytes of storage for the next 20 years is going to be way more expensive than owning it. However, you may not want to be in that space, which I get. And the other thing, like I mentioned earlier, is you do have to factor in the cost that you may run out of data center floor space at some point. And building new data centers, you think there's regulations around data. Wait till you see the regulations around building a data center, plus the cost, of course. Let's do one last question because I think it's really important for the viewers, Vicki. How does your SaaS pricing model work?
Great. We've got a variety of flexibility here. First of all, it's based on the amount of source data that anybody is putting into Operavi, but we give you a variety of options. You can start with a pay-as-you-go model. That is just a monthly bill based on how much data Operavi is managing, or you can have preset plans that are monthly or annually. And our pricing model is right on our website, so we are very transparent about this. And you can just visit the website and click on pricing to see what it looks like. And as with most SaaS pricing models, you get a little bit of a discount if you go to, say, an annual, a little bit of a discount if you're on monthly over pay-as-you-go, and a little bit more of a discount on annual if you go with an annual fee. So it's very, very flexible, and it's very OpEx, not CapEx centric.
And what I like about it is it allows people to kind of grow into the solution, right? They don't have to jump in with both feet. They can kind of have you run on a bit of their data, and then as they start to build trust and see that you can do everything you said you can do, they can add to it, right?
And in fact, that's what we typically see. We see typically customers will start with, maybe a server or a set of servers that are primary storage for their unstructured data, and it could be terabytes, and it typically is many terabytes, but it's not the petabytes that the company has, that they grow into that over time.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So, well, we're going to end it there. Give folks an extra 5 minutes of their day. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Again, if you want to send this webinar to a friend, just send the same URL that you use to get in. It will take them to the on-demand event, and by the time you send that email and they receive it, the on-demand event will be available. Again, look for the attachments, and then lastly, please give us feedback as you leave the presentation. Vicki, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your help with the webinar.
Well, thanks for inviting us.
Glad to do it. And I want to thank all of you guys for attending. For now, though, I am George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Thank you for joining us.